In June of 1980, a car jolted to a stop in a parking lot on the outskirts of a small Utah suburb. The car door opened, and a man stepped out into the darkness, and he stumbled across the parking lot towards the large building where he worked. He'd been drinking, and he was definitely feeling it, so he stood outside the building for a minute and tried to collect himself. He knew this might be the last moment of peace he or anyone in his community would have in a long time, because he knew something that nobody else inside the building would even imagine. He knew for a fact that someone had just committed the first murder ever recorded in the safe, quiet Utah town. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please set a fake cracked screen wallpaper on the follow button's new phone and watch them panic. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Thursday, June 5th, 1980, 25-year-old Karen Strom pulled her yellow Camaro into the front driveway of her two-story house in Woods Cross, Utah, a small suburb of Salt Lake City. Karen and her husband, Steve, stepped out and approached the house, which was yellow like the car, and that was not a coincidence. Karen just really loved yellow, and Steve had been more than happy to go along with her when they bought the place. The two of them had just come from dinner, and when they were all dressed up for a night out, some people found it hard to believe that Karen and Steve were just this average couple who lived in a small Utah suburb. Instead, they thought the pair looked more like a Hollywood couple. Karen had long blonde hair and light eyes, and she always looked right at home behind the wheel of her sleek sports car. Steve was tall with red hair and a red beard, and whenever they had their photo taken together, it was like they knew exactly how to pose. However, despite what some people thought about them based on their good looks, those who actually knew Karen and Steve understood that they were just like most young people in the area. They worked hard at their jobs, they talked about starting a family one day, and they loved living in the safe, secluded neighborhood not far from the beautiful Wasatch Mountains. Karen and Steve headed inside the house, and Karen turned on the TV, and then both of them sat down on the couch to watch. But while Karen leaned back and got comfortable, Steve couldn't seem to settle down. They'd gone out to dinner to celebrate both Steve's 27th birthday and also their 7th anniversary. Now, Karen was ready to relax for the rest of the night, but she knew Steve couldn't really do that because he still had to go to work that night. He had a late shift at a local factory that went all the way until 7:30 the following morning. So as Karen sat there, Steve tried to sit for a little while, but then just began getting up and collecting things he would need for work. And then he would come back to the couch but would be anxious and get up again and get something else that he would need for work. Now, Karen knew that Steve would much rather finish the birthday and anniversary celebration at home with her than go to the factory. But the truth was, Karen actually couldn't wait for Steve to go to work. Because even though she'd gone out with Steve to celebrate, and she was now laughing and chatting with him on the couch, in reality, Karen didn't want to even be in the house with her husband anymore, and she'd felt this way for months. Karen and Steve had been high school sweethearts, so they'd been together since they were teenagers. Back in school, Karen had been outgoing and extremely popular, while Steve had always been quiet and a bit shy. But when they'd met at school, they'd gotten along right away, and they had fallen in love fast. So in 1973, not long after they graduated from high school, they got married, and then they moved into a small apartment together and began their lives together. And for a time, the marriage had been everything Karen had dreamed of. She and Steve weren't rich by any means, but they were smart with their money, and they had eventually saved up enough to move out of their first small apartment and buy the yellow house that Karen had loved so much. And back then, the two of them had seemed like partners in everything. They had the same goals, and they truly supported each other. But the longer they stayed together, the more Karen had begun to see a side of Steve that was nothing like the reserved, caring man she fell in love with, because Steve had begun drinking a lot. In fact, there were some nights when Steve and Karen would go out with a couple they were friends with, and Steve would get so drunk that Karen and the other couple would have to literally carry him out to the car. And then, they'd have to carry him from the car to his bed when they got back to the house. But as much as that upset Karen, she didn't even consider those nights to be the worst nights. Because sometimes when Steve drank, he didn't just get sloppy. He got angry and aggressive. And when Karen's sister and friends had started to worry that Steve might be getting violent with her, Karen would defend Steve, saying he was a good guy who just had some bad nights sometimes. But finally, about 3 months before their 7th wedding anniversary, Karen couldn't take Steve's heavy drinking mood swings anymore, and she'd made what she considered to be the hardest decision of her life. She told Steve that she wanted a divorce, and she'd started spending most nights at her stepmom's house. Even though they were now separated, Karen still went out with Steve sometimes. She still came by the house to see him, and she would even sleep there with him some nights. She knew Steve hoped that meant they could maybe patch things up, but in reality, she just didn't see any hope for their marriage anymore. Back at the house, Karen continued to watch TV anxiously, waiting for the moment when she could be alone and go to sleep by herself in her old bed. And a little after midnight on June 6th, Steve finally said it was time for him to go to work. So Karen got off the couch, walked with him to the front door, and Steve gave her a kiss. Karen told him to have a good night at work. She said she was going right to bed, and she would see him in the morning when he got home. And once Steve was gone, Karen did head right down the hallway to the bedroom, changed out of her clothes, and climbed into bed. However, she had so many things running through her mind that she couldn't sleep. As upset as she was about Steve's alcohol issues and her crumbling marriage as a result of those issues, this relationship was basically all she'd known since she was a kid. And part of her did still really love Steve. She knew that was why she had not been able to fully walk away yet. But as she lay in bed, Karen felt sure that even if leaving Steve for good would be challenging, it was something she just had to do. And she just had to finally make a clean break and stop staying at this house altogether. She had to start living her own life somewhere else. About 8 hours later, around 7:00 a.m. on June 6th, 1980, Stephen locked the front door of the yellow house, walked inside, and headed right to the bedroom. Steve felt exhausted from his overnight shift, and he couldn't wait to get some sleep. He called Karen before he left work, but she hadn't answered, and he'd seen her yellow Camaro still parked out front, so he figured she just hadn't woken up yet. However, when he opened the bedroom door, he froze right there in the doorway. The room was completely trashed. The small TV had been knocked off its stand, one of the bedside tables had been pushed over, and the bed's brass headboard was broken. Then Steve looked down at the floor, and he began to scream because there on the ground, sticking out behind the bed, were Karen's feet. Steve ran into the room hysterical, shouting Karen's name, but when he got to her, he saw that she was totally motionless, just laying there in a t-shirt and her underwear. He crouched down and tried to get her to wake up, but he could tell very quickly that she must be dead. Steve stood up, and the room felt like it was spinning. He stumbled outside, made his way to the phone in the kitchen, and dialed 911. Later that morning, Detective Clarence Montgomery of the Woods Cross Police walked towards Karen and Steve's front doors. He was responding to a call that had come into the station that said a young woman, Karen Strom, had been found unresponsive inside of her home. As he approached the door, Detective Montgomery saw a uniformed officer standing in the front yard, along with a red-haired man who had his face buried in his hands. Montgomery walked past the red-haired man and the uniformed officer and walked into the house. There he connected with another uniformed officer who'd arrived first at the scene, who would tell Montgomery that Karen was deceased, and then he led him down the hallway to the bedroom. At the threshold of the bedroom, Montgomery slipped on a pair of gloves, then he walked inside, and right away he noticed the TV on the floor and the broken bed. Then he walked around the bed and crouched down over Karen's body, and he saw there were deep purple bruises on her neck and throat. And Montgomery just couldn't believe it, because he figured that these bruises were a clear sign that Karen had been murdered, strangled to death. But Woods Cross, Utah, where Montgomery had worked as a cop for a decade, was a very safe and quiet town. And in the 45 years since the town had been founded, there had literally never been a reported homicide. Montgomery stood up and told the other officer to radio in for a forensic team. While they waited on the forensics team, the other police officer, the one who was first on the scene, radioed the station to have them inform the medical examiner's office about the case. And then that officer left to go contact Karen's family to tell them about her death. So while that was happening and Montgomery was just waiting, he just did a complete sweep of the bedroom on his own. Now, despite having never handled a homicide case before, Montgomery knew instinctively that for the room to look like this, to be in complete disarray, could indicate that perhaps a robber was here and had ransacked the place in addition to, killing Karen. However, after doing the sweep of the bedroom, Montgomery did not come to that conclusion. Instead, he believed someone had come into this bedroom with the sole intent to kill Karen. And the broken bed and the TV on the floor meant one thing: Karen had put up a real fight for her life. So Montgomery went back to Karen's body, and what he saw now seemed to support his theory. The detective found scratches on Karen's arms that looked like defensive wounds, and he also saw that parts of her fingernails had broken off. Not long after Montgomery had fully searched the room, the small forensics team arrived, and they did the same thing. And they came to the same conclusion that Montgomery had, that very likely this was a targeted attack on Karen and that Karen had fought back really aggressively. And so they thought that if that was the case, very likely her attacker then had physical marks left on them from Karen. The forensics team dusted the room and the entire house for fingerprints. They also clipped parts of Karen's fingernails and took blood samples from her clothes to save as evidence for possible testing at the crime lab. So, in 1980, DNA testing was still in its earliest phase, and it would be years before police departments would use it in investigations. Still, forensic technicians were aware that advances in investigatory technology could happen fast, so they would often collect evidence that they knew they couldn't really test yet, in the hope that maybe at some point in the future, if a crime remained unsolved, new technology and testing would make that evidence viable. As the forensics team continued their work in the house, Detective Montgomery headed outside to speak to the red-haired man he'd seen when he first arrived. The man Montgomery now knew was Karen's husband, Stephen. Montgomery could immediately see that Steve was a mess. He was sobbing and looked like he was struggling to catch his breath. Montgomery honestly felt bad for him. However, in a case like this, the spouse was the first suspect. So, after approaching Steve and introducing himself, he began by asking him where he'd been that morning and also where he'd been the night before. Through tears, Steve told Montgomery about his and Karen's dinner, how he'd left her to go to work at the factory around midnight, and that he'd gotten back home around 7:30 that morning. Steve said he'd unlocked the front door, gone right to the bedroom, and found Karen. As Montgomery heard this, he immediately focused on the part where Steve said he unlocked the front door, because Montgomery had not found any evidence of forced entry into the house. But if Steve was telling the truth about the door being locked when he got home, Montgomery thought whoever attacked Karen had to have a key, or it had to have been someone Karen would open the door for late at night. But before Montgomery could question Steve further, he heard the sound of a car screeching to a halt right outside the house. The detective looked up, saw the car to fly open, and watched as a young woman, who was maybe 20 years old, marched towards him. And this young woman pointed right at Steve and shouted, "He finally did it. He killed her." Steve stammered, and Montgomery rushed over to the young woman, trying to keep the situation from getting out of hand. Montgomery tried to calm this young woman down, but it clearly was not working. She said that she was Karen's little sister, Coco, and she rushed over as soon as she had gotten the news about her sister's death. And she said again that she was sure Steve had killed her. However, as Montgomery was trying to keep Coco separated from Steve, something happened that made Coco break down even more. The front door of the house opened, and members of the medical examiner's staff wheeled Karen out in a black body bag gag. And Coco saw it and just crumbled. She started sobbing uncontrollably, and then she told them not to do that, not to take Karen away. Everything about this was new for Detective Montgomery. He'd never dealt with a murder case, and he already felt like the situation at the house was spiraling totally out of control. He knew he needed to act fast before things got worse. So, he called an officer over to stay with Karen's sister to make sure she was okay. He had no idea if there was any truth to the accusations Coco had thrown at Steve, or if it was just how she was dealing with her anger, shock, and grief, but that didn't matter right now. Montgomery marched back across the yard and told Steve they needed to talk down at the station right now. Not long after that, Detective Montgomery led Steve into a small office at the police station. And once they were sitting down, it was clear Steve was still visibly shaken. Montgomery asked him a few basic questions about his and Karen's marriage. He wanted to know if they'd been fighting or had been experiencing any financial problems, anything like that. Steve admitted that he and Karen had hit a rough patch recently, but he said they were working things out. They'd been in love since they were teenagers, and they were both committed to trying to make the marriage work. He said they'd just gone out the night before to celebrate their anniversary. And then Steve said again that after that, he'd gone to work right around midnight. And he said everything seemed fine and that Karen had told him she would see him in the morning. As Steve spoke, Montgomery made a note of Steve's work schedule. Then he asked if there was anyone other than family that Karen might open the door for late at night. Steve nodded and gave Montgomery a list of some of their closest friends. After that, the two men talked for a bit longer, and then eventually, Montgomery told Steve he could leave for now. However, the police would soon follow up. After Steve left, Montgomery sat alone for a while, thinking through Steve's story. It'd be easy enough to follow up on his work alibi at the factory, but right now, Montgomery had no idea of Karen's actual time of death. For all he knew, Steve was her killer, and maybe he killed her before he even went to work, and everything he said about discovering Karen's body could just be a complete lie. However, for the time being, he had no evidence pointing directly at Steve or really anybody else. So, he looked down at the list of friends that Steve had just given him, and he saw one name that might help him verify Steve's alibi and allow him to learn more about Steve and Karen's marriage all at once. The man's name was Ed Owens, and he was Steve's co-worker and one of the couple's friends. Late in the afternoon on June 6th, so several hours after Karen's body had been discovered, Detective Montgomery sat down with Ed Owens in an office at a factory. In town, Ed sat there in silence for a minute with a stunned look on his face. He couldn't believe the news Montgomery had just given him about Karen's murder. He said it didn't make sense. People loved Karen. She was beautiful, unkind, and caring. Montgomery acknowledged that, but he stayed on task and he asked Ed if he'd seen Steve the night before. Ed told him that they had briefly crossed paths at the factory, but he and Steve had worked different shifts, so they didn't really talk or anything. Then Montgomery asked about Steve and Karen's relationship, and at this Ed began to shift a little and got an uncomfortable look on his face. Eventually, he said that he and his wife were good friends with Steve and Karen, and they would go out together and usually things were great. But sometimes Steve would drink really heavily, to the point where they would have to literally carry him out to the car and even carry him up to his bed on occasion. But Ed was quick to say that despite his alcoholism, Steve loved Karen more than anyone and that Steve really was a good guy. After Montgomery finished with the interview, he tracked down Steve's manager, who did have a record of Steve clocking and unclocking out at the times he had said. And also, several other employees vouched that Steve had worked the late shift. But again, this didn't really prove anything to Montgomery. He needed to know a time of death to know if Steve showing up for work really was an alibi or not. Like, he could have killed her before he showed up for work. Over the next couple of days, Detective Montgomery and his small investigative team interviewed Karen's friends, family, and co-workers, and a pattern quickly started to emerge. Almost all of them said similar things to what Karen's sister Coco had told police. They had worried about what Steve might do to Karen after he'd been drinking, and some of them said they'd even seen bruises on Karen that clearly she had tried to cover up. This felt like a big discovery to Detective Montgomery. If he could prove that Steve had a history of violence towards his wife, well, he could then connect that to the violent attack that led to Karen's death. And in addition to that, Karen's friends all said something else that also made Steve look bad. They told Montgomery that no matter what Steve said about the marriage, Karen had genuinely been ready to end the marriage. In fact, they told Montgomery that Karen hadn't just brought up divorce and gone to stay with her stepmom. She'd actually started dating somebody else, a car mechanic whose name was Buff Bangerter, and Steve knew all about it. This immediately made Montgomery start to rethink his whole case, or at least it made him consider other possibilities. He'd been so focused on Steve because he believed that Karen's decision to move out of the house could have potentially pushed Steve over the edge and lead to him attacking and killing her in a moment of rage. And also, finding out about Karen's new boyfriend could definitely have made Steve even angrier. But now Montgomery also wondered if the man Karen had started dating, Buff, might have gotten jealous that Karen still spent time and even still spent the night occasionally with her husband, Steve. And so maybe if that was the case, Buff could have potentially shown up to the house late at night to confront her, and there was a good chance Karen would have opened the door for him and let him inside. So now it was clear that Montgomery had a potentially angry and jealous husband and a potentially angry and jealous boyfriend. On June 8th, so 2 days after Karen's body had been found in her room, Detective Montgomery sat down with the man Karen had started dating before she died, Buff Bangaro. Buff was cordial and cooperative right from the start. He said he was 35 years old, so about 10 years older than Karen, but he said the age gap really hadn't mattered. He said the two of them had hit it off soon after they had met a couple of months earlier. They both loved cars, and they both dreamed of starting a family someday, and they both desperately wanted to be in a healthy relationship that was built on kindness and mutual respect. Buff also said that he knew all about Karen's relationship with her husband, Steve, and he never did anything to stand in the way of it. In fact, he said he didn't have any issue at all with Karen spending time at the house and even staying with Steve overnight. He knew they'd been together a long time and they were still married. So Buff said the last thing he wanted to do was get in the way if there was a chance that maybe Karen and Steve could save their marriage. As Buff said all this, Montgomery got the impression that Buff was truly heartbroken about Karen's death. Like he did not come off as if he was lying. Still, that didn't mean he was innocent. After all, Buff's alibi was pretty weak. He said on the night that Karen got murdered, he'd been at home by himself. After their talk, Detective Montgomery let Buff go. He wasn't going to cross Buff off his suspect list by any means, but the interview with Buff didn't do much to change Montgomery's mind about Steve. He believed there were just too many factors that still made Steve the most likely killer. Now Montgomery just needed some piece of hard evidence that would help him cement that theory. The next day, June 9th, so 3 days into the investigation, Detective Montgomery sat at his desk reading over the autopsy report that he'd been waiting for. The medical examiner had determined that while there were clear signs of a physical altercation before death, there was no indication of sexual assault. He also stated that the cause of death was indeed strangulation. Now, this did not surprise Montgomery. It had seemed clear to him that Karen had been strangled from the moment he saw her body. But as Montgomery continued to read, he saw there was a note from the medical examiner that made him feel like suddenly everything was falling into place. Because the autopsy report stated that Karen's time of death could have been anywhere between 10:00 p.m. on June 5th and 2:00 a.m. on June 6th, which meant that Karen's husband, Steve, who did have an alibi for being at work just after midnight, could have, based on timeline, killed her in the couple of hours before he left. And so Detective Montgomery stood up at his desk and sprung into action. He sent officers out to go get Steve and bring him back to the station. Later that afternoon, Montgomery was once again sitting across from Steve. But this time, Steve wasn't crying and trying to catch his breath. Instead, he just had an angry and annoyed look on his face. And Steve didn't waste any time. He told Montgomery that everything he'd said in their first meeting was the truth. Karen had been fine the last time he saw her. He also said he loved his wife and would never hurt her. Then, Steve did something that took Montgomery completely by surprise. Steve leaned in across the table and literally demanded that the police give him a polygraph test right now. Now, even highly cooperative suspects do not volunteer to take polygraphs before the police have even mentioned it. But Montgomery said he'd be happy to accommodate Steve's wishes. So, a little later that afternoon, officers hooked Steve up to the polygraph machine and asked him a series of questions pertaining to his relationship with Karen and to his whereabouts on the night of June 5th and the morning of June 6th. And when the results quickly came back, it showed that Steve had failed. Going over those results, Detective Montgomery was now absolutely convinced Steve was the killer. However, He knew polygraph tests were not admissible evidence in court, so he had to find something more tangible if he wanted to put together a case that the district attorney would be willing to take on. So again, Montgomery had to let Steve go, and this really frustrated him. Because Montgomery was feeling an enormous amount of pressure to solve this case. He wanted to get justice for Karen and her family, but he also knew that since this was the first murder case in the community, he was now setting a precedent, and he wanted to prove that the people of Woods Cross could trust their police force to get the job done. Throughout the end of June and all of July, Detective Montgomery and his team dug deep into every aspect of Steve and Karen's lives. The forensics unit had found Steve's fingerprints all over the crime scene, but of course that didn't help Montgomery. It was Steve's house, so it would have actually seemed more incriminating, and like Steve had wiped the place clean if none of his prints had been found. So Montgomery and his investigators interviewed Karen's sister, Coco, Steve's co-worker and the couple's friend, Ed Owens, and anybody else they could find who was even remotely close to Karen. And during these interviews, talk of Steve's drinking and potentially violent nature towards her kept coming up. Then Montgomery talked to one of Karen's co-workers, who he hadn't spoken to at the beginning of the investigation. And she said that a few months earlier when Karen had come into work, it was plainly obvious that she had caked layers of makeup onto her neck and throat. But the woman said that despite all that makeup, she could clearly see. There were dark bruises on Karen's neck. Seeing these bruises, this co-worker had gotten really concerned and had asked Karen what was going on, and she told her that she had gotten the bruises when Steve tried to strangle her. And as soon as Montgomery heard this, he believed he'd finally gotten the break in the case that he needed. As far as he was concerned, this proved not only that Steve had a history of violence, but that he had already strangled his wife at least once. And so, Montgomery knew his next step was to secure an arrest warrant for Steve Strong. By August of 1980, so about 2 months after Karen's murder, Steve had been arrested and was being held in custody. And over the next month, as Steve sat in prison, Detective Montgomery believed that he and his team had put together a very strong case and that Steve would soon be found guilty of murder. But in September, Montgomery got a phone call at his desk and he heard the district attorney's voice on the other line. And the DA said he'd just gotten some really bad news. The judge had ruled that the story Karen's co-worker had told about Steve strangling Karen was inadmissible as evidence. The judge had determined that witnesses could only testify on what they'd seen, not just what they heard. And Karen's co-worker had simply passed on information about Steve strangling Karen that she said Karen had told her. Nobody, including that co-worker, had actually seen Steve strangle Karen. As Detective Montgomery listened to the DA, he got a sick feeling in his stomach, and things only got worse. The DA said the issue with the co-worker's story had raised concerns about any story from one of Karen's friends or family who said they believed Steve physically assaulted Karen because, like that co-worker, all those people had never actually seen the abuse firsthand. Montgomery knew how this conversation was going to end even before it happened, but hearing it out loud still felt like a kick in the gut. Because the DA said he no longer believed they had enough evidence to win in court, and they couldn't risk putting Steve on trial and losing. Because if Steve was found not guilty in Karen's murder case, by law, he could never be tried for Karen's murder again. So for the time being, the case would be dismissed and Steve would be set free. The call from the DA left Detective Montgomery reeling. He knew the forensics team and crime lab had done all they could do at this point. So, unless a new eyewitness came out of the woodwork or some new piece of concrete evidence materialized, there was little Montgomery could do to propel the case forward. And as months passed by, nothing new surfaced, and so by early 1981, Karen's murder case had gone cold. Still, Montgomery continued to work the case whenever he had time, and he fielded regular calls from Karen's sister, Coco, who desperately wanted updates. But Montgomery never had any news for her. Eventually, Detective Montgomery retired from the force, and at that point, the first reported murder in the history of Woods Cross, Utah, basically disappeared from the public eye. However, decades later, Karen's name would once again dominate the local news. In 2006, Over 26 years after Karen's murder, Detective Brad Benson of the Woods Cross Police Department walked into his boss's office. Detective Benson had been a rookie on the force back in 1980 when Karen had gotten murdered. He hadn't been part of the investigation, but he'd never forgotten about the case. Over the past 2.5 decades, Woods Cross had remained a small, quiet suburb with a relatively low crime rate. And so today, Detective Benson found himself in a situation that was pretty common. He had no major criminal cases to work. So he asked his boss if he could take up a cold case, the murder of Karen Strom. His boss stared him down for a second. Like Benson, his boss knew all about the case and the huge impact that it had on the community back in the 1980s. But he wanted to know why, after so many years, Benson thought he could possibly crack the case when nobody else could. And Benson said, well, because technology had advanced leaps and bounds since Karen had gotten killed. And Benson's boss couldn't argue with that, and he said Benson could go work the cold case until another case came his way. After Benson left the office, he didn't necessarily think Karen's murder would suddenly be an open and shut case. But he knew the original investigators had a strong suspect, Karen's husband, Steve, but they just could not put enough evidence together that would hold up in court. Benson quickly made his way down a brightly lit set of stairs into a much more dimly lit basement. And once he was there, he looked over shelves stacked with boxes that were filled with evidence from old or forgotten cases. Eventually, he found a box full of evidence from Karen's murder, and when he opened it, he said a silent thank you to Detective Montgomery. Because it was clear to Benson that before Montgomery retired, he had made sure that all of the evidence in that case was securely stored and cataloged in detail. And within days, Benson was able to send 2 major pieces of evidence to the crime lab for testing: clippings of Karen's fingernails and the underwear that she'd been wearing when she was found dead. Now that it was 2006, the lab could run a series of in-depth DNA tests on those pieces of evidence that back in 1980 simply were not possible. Now, Detective Benson knew that since so much time had passed, there was a chance that any potential DNA samples could have become corrupted by now, but he hoped that the care that Detective Montgomery and his team had clearly shown for these pieces of evidence would mean they were still viable for testing. It would take some time for the results to come in, but in early 2007, now 27 years after Karen's murder, Detective Benson was sitting at his desk staring down at a crime lab report, and his hands were literally shaking from excitement. After reading through the whole report, Benson dug through a file folder and found a phone number. Then he grabbed his cell phone and called it. A moment later, a woman in her mid-40s answered. It was Karen's little sister, Coco. And with his voice shaking, Benson told Coco that after all this time, he finally had the evidence police needed to prove who killed her sister. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted off and on over the course of 27 years. This is what police believe happened to Karen when she was murdered in early June of 1980. The killer opened the front door of the house and walked inside. It was dark and quiet, and they slowly made their way down the hall towards the bedroom. When they reached the bedroom, they opened the door. In the moonlight shining through the window, they could see Karen lying in bed. But as the killer stepped into the room, Karen woke up startled, and she sat upright. The killer then moved towards the bed and said something out loud. Karen could smell the alcohol in their breath and shouted for them to get out. But the killer moved fast. They lunged towards the bed and grabbed Karen by her shoulders. Karen dug her fingernails into the killer's arms and gashed them, and the killer stumbled backwards. Karen leapt out of bed and tried to run for the door, but the killer caught her and grabbed her again. Karen kept fighting. The two of them stumbled through the dark room and slammed into a table, and a small TV crashed to the floor. Karen kept slashing at the killer's arms and face, but she just couldn't break free. The killer pushed her back across the room. They knocked against the bedside table, and the killer threw Karen onto the bed. The killer then leapt on top of her, but she just kept fighting back. Both of them hit against the brass headboard, and the 2 brass bars just broke. Karen kicked and clawed, and she did get away from the bed again, but this time the killer grabbed her and slammed her down to the floor. Karen felt the wind knocked out of her and she couldn't even move. So the killer pinned her down and tried to sexually assault her, but Karen still fought back. And so the killer panicked and just wrapped their hands around her throat and began to squeeze. and Karen choked and gagged and struggled to breathe until she died right there on the floor next to her bed. After that, the killer stood up, stumbled out of the room in a daze, ran down the hall out of the house, slamming the door behind them. They ran past the yellow Camaro parked in the front ductway and climbed into their own car. Then they hit the gas and sped off into the darkness. It was still dark out early in the morning. The killer exhaled and relaxed a bit once they were gone. They knew it would be at least a few hours before Steve got home from work. Despite Detective Montgomery, his team, and Coco's wholehearted belief that Karen's husband, Steve, had killed her, that was not the case. Karen's murderer was also not the man she'd recently begun dating before she died, Buff Bangerter. Instead, the person who had killed her was Steve's co-worker and Karen and Steve's friend, Ed Owens. It would turn out that at some point during their platonic friendship, Ed decided that he wanted more. He had become sexually attracted to Karen, and on the night of the murder, he'd left work, gone to a bar to have a few drinks, and decided that that was the night he was going to try to have sex with Karen. After all, he knew that Karen was staying at that house and that Steve was going to be out all night working, so Karen was alone. So Ed went to the yellow house, and he found the front door was unlocked, which was actually pretty typical for homes in this town. In fact, police were never sure if the door had actually been locked when Steve got home the following morning, like he said, or if he just misremembered. And so once Ed was inside the house, he went right to the bedroom and attempted to sexually assault Karen. And in the process, he killed her. Now, police had questioned Ed back in the 1980 seconds, and in the initial interview, Detective Montgomery had noticed scratches on Ed's arms and face. But Ed had told him that he got scratches on him like that all the time from working the machines in the factory. And several of his co-workers backed that claim up. A number of people had also said they saw Ed at a local bar around the time Karen had been killed. But moreover, Montgomery and the police just could not find any clear motive that would lead Ed to kill Karen. But over 2.5 decades later, when Detective Benson took over the cold case, he sent evidence back to the crime lab. And using the latest technology, the lab was able to detect traces of seminal fluid under Karen's fingernails and blood on Karen's underwear. And that indicated to them that the killer had attempted to sexually assault Karen. But she had fought him off and drawn drops of the killer's blood that landed on her underwear. And both of those DNA samples found on Karen matched Ed Owens. Once Benson had this information, he tracked down Ed Owens, who was 56 years old at the time. And Ed would eventually confess to the murder. Ed was found guilty, and he received a sentence based on Utah's legal statutes from when the crimes had occurred. This meant Ed was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, which had been the maximum sentence back in 1980. He would die in prison in 2021. On a morning in early 1996 in Arizona, someone sat hunched over a desk furiously writing a letter, and almost every line of this letter included a direct threat of violence this person was going to inflict on the recipient. They kept on writing, saying every horrible thing that they wanted to do. Finally, when they were done, they read the letter over. It was explicit and terrifying, just as they'd hoped. They put the letter down, then glanced over at a cardboard box sitting on the floor, and they smiled. Nobody would ever suspect that the contents of that plain box would soon help them carry out this very buzz, or plot they'd had running through their head for months. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please get a hold of the follow button's house keys and swap them out for random fake keys. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of Monday, March 24th, 1996, 46-year-old Julie Williams finished up getting ready for work in her bedroom in Mesa, Arizona. And as she did, she couldn't stop smiling. When she was done, she took a final look in the mirror, then grabbed her purse and headed outside to her car. And as she made her 20-minute morning commute to the city of Tempe, where her office was, she saw other people heading to work. And she saw businesses and shops opening up, and this made her smile just keep getting bigger. Julie had been working as a secretary at an insurance agency for the past several months, and she actually loved going in every day. It wasn't that she always dreamed of working in insurance or anything like that, but for the first time in years, Julie had started to feel a real sense of purpose and peace at her job. Because Julie had dedicated most of her life to this point to being a mother to her 3 daughters. She'd stayed at home in California, where she'd lived while the girls were growing up. She stayed home so she could look after them and cook them dinners and just be there for them all the time and give them the best life they possibly could have. Julie's daughters were everything to her. Now, Julie would not have traded that time with her daughters for anything in the world. She didn't regret it at all. But now her daughters were grown up. They were married and even beginning families of their own. Once all 3 of them had officially moved out of the house, Julie really struggled. She didn't really know how to live without them. It was like now that she was an empty nester, she didn't know what to do. And to make matters worse, following her kids leaving, she and her husband got divorced, so she really was beginning to feel lost and alone. But Julie had decided she would just have to make some major changes to basically save her life. And so she had moved from California to Arizona, where one of her daughters lived, and she had set out to start the next phase of her life, which she was determined to make a happy one. Just before 8:00 a.m., Julie turned off a road in Tempe and pulled into the parking lot of a large office building that housed several businesses, including the insurance company where she worked. She parked her car and headed to the front door. She pulled her magnetic badge out of her purse and swiped it across the card reader that was just to the side of the door. She heard the lock click open, so she walked inside and headed down a hallway to her company's office. This particular branch of this insurance company was rather small. Julie was one of only 5 employees there. But this small office had played a major part in helping her start this new phase of her life. Julie liked the job and got along well with the few other people she worked with there. But most importantly, working here had helped Julie realize she could be independent and that she could have goals for herself that had nothing to do with taking care of other people. And this realization had already inspired Julie to do other things on her own. She'd started making new friends and going out with them on the weekends, and she'd become an active member in her church. Inside the office, Julie said hello to a couple of the other employees who'd also just arrived, and at some point, one of her co-workers named Deborah Grisham waved to her and came over, and the 2 women began chatting about their weekends as they headed to the break room to put on a pot of coffee before beginning the workday. But just a few minutes later, Julie's co-worker Deborah rushed out of the break room with a concerned look on her face. She saw Julie running down a hallway and she called after her if Julie needed help, but Julie didn't respond. The other 3 employees saw and heard Deborah calling out, and they immediately got up from their desks and came over to see what was going on. But Deborah just shook her head like she didn't even understand what was happening. She said that she and Julie were talking in the break room making coffee, and then all of a sudden Julie said she felt sick and dizzy and just took off running down the hallway towards the bathroom. Deborah said Julie looked really bad, like something was genuinely wrong with her. From the hallway, Deborah continued to call out to Julie to see if she needed anything, but she didn't get any response. So she and another female employee went into the woman's bathroom, and when they stepped inside, they immediately began to panic. Because through the crack under one of the bathroom stall doors, they could clearly see Julie slumped over on the floor. Immediately, Deborah and the other woman ran to the stall, but they couldn't get it open. And so, the other employee, so not Deborah, she dropped to the floor and crawled under the bathroom stall door. And when she actually got a good look at Julie, she immediately shouted to Deborah to call 911. About 15 minutes later, Officer Sue Scoville of the Tempe Police Department was driving through the city in her cruiser when she got a message from dispatch. A woman had been found unresponsive inside of a bathroom in a nearby office building. There wasn't much information other than that, but dispatch said paramedics were already on the way. Officer Scoville said she'd head right over to the office building, then she turned and hit the gas. As Scoville drove, she began to run through a series of statements in her head, like she was repeating some kind of mantra. And what she was saying to herself was basically every step she had been trained to take when she arrived on the scene. Because Officer Scoville was not experienced. She was actually a rookie cop. And even though there was really no expectation that she would fully understand what she was walking into, I mean, she didn't and nobody would, she still wanted to. make sure that when she got there, she followed procedure and did everything just right. So as Scoville sped towards the office building, she kept repeating those steps over and over. And then when she arrived, she jumped right into action. Scoville walked into the big business building and made her way over to the insurance agency. And there at the door, she saw her employees, and all of them looked like they were completely in shock. Just before Scoville had arrived, she'd received word that paramedics had arrived at the scene and taken the woman who had collapsed to the hospital. And so, for all Scoville knew, this woman might have just had a heart attack or some other medical emergency. But in the office, Scoville cycled through the steps she would need to take in her head once again, and then began taking those steps. She asked the employees who the woman was who collapsed and exactly what had happened that morning prior to calling 911. Deborah said the woman who had been taken to the hospital was Julie Williams, a secretary in the office. Deborah said Julie had arrived at work that morning at about 8:00, like she always did. Officer Scoville asked if Julie had seemed okay when she first got there. Had she seemed sick, or maybe looked like she was physically struggling in any way? But Deborah just shook her head. She said no, Julie seemed fine. They talked about their weekends and gone to the break room together. But then Julie took a sip of water, got this weird look on her face, and told Deborah not to drink any. Then before they could do anything else or say anything else, Julie said she felt sick and turned and ran out to the bathroom. Scoville took down some notes and then asked Deborah to lead her to the break room. The break room was a small, brightly lit room with a sink, a refrigerator, a lunch table, a coffee station, and a water cooler. Officer Scoville walked over to the water cooler. It looked like any normal water cooler in a typical office break room, but she already had a hunch. She asked if anybody else had had a cup of water that morning from this water cooler. And when she said that, Deborah had this really surprised look on her face, like she'd completely forgotten something huge. And she said, "Me? I got water earlier, but as soon as I tasted it, it just tasted strange. And so I had spit it out and dumped the water down the drain." Officer Scoville didn't waste any time. She told Deborah to step out of the break room and to make sure nobody else came in there. Deborah nodded and walked out. Scoville still wasn't sure what was going on here, but she now had a real fear that the water in that cooler had caused Julie to get sick. And if that was the case, this might not be just a natural medical emergency. So Scoville radioed into the station and said they would need a detective on the scene right away. Later that morning, veteran detective Mike Palmer of the Tempe Police Department walked into the insurance agency and immediately met with Officer Scoville. In his 8 years as a detective, Palmer had gotten this reputation on the force for having what they called a sixth sense. He could just tell when something was off. Other police officers said he could arrive at a scene and see things that nobody else could see, like an entire crime would just come to him in a vision. Now, Detective Palmer kind of laughed off claims like that. As far as he was concerned, the sixth sense people talked about was just him being hyper-observant and trying to ask the right questions. He told Scoville that he had called the hospital before he left the station, and he learned that Julie Williams, their victim, was in a coma. And based on an MRI and CAT scan, doctors already feared she would never wake up. They said she had gone into cardiac arrest and suffered brain damage, but at this point, they still didn't know what the cause was. Scoville told Detective Palmer all the details she had gotten from Julie's co-worker, Deborah. She told him that Julie had supposedly gotten a drink from the water cooler right before she passed out, and before that, Deborah had apparently tried the water, basically barely sipped it, but said it tasted funny and had just spit it out right away. Palmer put on a pair of gloves, and he and Officer Scoville headed to the break room. Palmer grabbed a cup and he filled it from the water cooler, and the smell immediately hit him. He told Scoville that her hunch about the water being bad was definitely right because, he said, this cup of water had a distinct common smell. He would need to bring a forensics team in and get the crime lab to run tests to be sure. But he was confident that that smell could only mean one thing. The water in the cooler had been contaminated with cyanide. Cyanide is a highly toxic and potentially deadly chemical. It can be found in liquid and powder forms, and sometimes it can give off a distinct odor that smells a lot like almonds. But even when that's the case, not everyone can pick up this almond smell. But Detective Palmer, who people already believed could see more than other cops, had smelled it right away. Palmer stood up, poured out the water, and started searching the rest of the kitchen. And when he got to the coffee station, he saw something that further supported the idea that cyanide had been used in here. The empty coffee pot had this strange crystalline residue inside of it. Palmer suspected this meant that cyanide had also been poured into the coffee pot, and the mugs that were sitting next to the pot also had a light coat of the same residue inside of them. So, it seemed to him like whoever did this had been trying to poison basically any drink somebody could have possibly gotten in this break room. Palmer told Scoville that there was no question in his mind about what had happened here. They were dealing with an attempted murder. Somebody had tried to make sure that Julie Williams or somebody else, or maybe everyone at the office, was going to ingest cyanide. Detective Palmer quickly radioed in that he needed a forensic team and several more officers on the scene. Then he walked out of the break room and found Julie's co-worker Deborah, and he had one simple question for her. When was the last time the coffee pot and the mugs in the break room got washed? Deborah said she knew that everything had been cleaned when she had left the office for the weekend. This past Friday evening, Palmer had shown up here, not knowing if he was walking into a crime scene or a medical emergency. And while he was still trying to get his mind around how or why somebody seemed to have poisoned the entire break room, Deborah's comment about things being washed on Friday enabled him to see a clear timeline of events. If Deborah was telling the truth, that meant the coffee pot and mugs had been contaminated, potentially with cyanide, sometime after Friday evening, after work, and before 8:00 on this Monday morning. To Palmer, this likely meant that whoever had done this had come into the office over the weekend and poisoned everything with cyanide. Then Deborah said, as far as she knew, nobody from the office had come into work over the weekend. However, the whole building did have a weekend cleaning crew that would have had access to the break room. And also there had been a construction crew working inside the building all weekend too. This made the list of people that Palmer would have to potentially track down a lot larger than just Julie's co-workers at the insurance agency. However, Palmer had noticed there was an card reader by the building door when he came in, and he thought that that reader would at least make identifying some of those people a bit easier. So, when the rest of his investigation team arrived, he sent several other officers to track down a list of every ID that had been used to access the building since Friday evening. However, because this was 1996, compiling a list from an ID reader was not a fast, simple computer function like it is now. And so, Detective Palmer knew that data collection like that would take some time. He also told his team to get the names of the people on the construction and cleaning crews that had been there as well. Palmer hoped that all of this would point him in the right direction because, as of right now, Palmer had no idea who the intended victim or victims were supposed to be. But he assumed it clearly had to be somebody at the insurance agency, and if Julie hadn't been the target, or at least not the sole target, he feared that others could still be in danger. Within hours of Julie being taken to the hospital, Detective Palmer's team was tracking down names of people who had weekend access to the building, and a forensics unit began a full sweep of the break room. And while that was happening, Detective Palmer met with the other employees, and things quickly took a turn. The first employee he spoke to was a man who was clearly upset about what had happened. He said he just didn't understand because everybody loved Julie. She was like a nice mom who looked out for everyone else. But when Palmer approached the desk of a 29-year-old woman named Diane Harry, she did not look upset. Standing next to her was a man who she would say was her husband, Louis. And apparently, after she had found out what happened to Julie, she had called him, and Louis had rushed right over to be with her. Palmer understood that, but from his perspective, it just seemed like Diane and Louis appeared to be in a total panic, like as if they were the ones who had been poisoned. And so Palmer asked them like, hey, why are you guys this upset? What's going on here? And Diane, at that point, would chime in and say, actually, that's an easy question to answer. Because she believed somebody was actually trying to kill her. This surprised Detective Palmer. So, he actually took a seat near Diane's desk and said, okay, what do you mean by that? And Diane said that both she and her husband, Louis, were being threatened by a very dangerous man. And so Palmer asked them to please tell him everything they could about this man. Diane immediately shot a look over at Lewis. He nodded, and in a low voice, he told Detective Palmer that this had all started a few months back when a friend named Verbrae Wooten had come to him for help. He said this woman, Verbrae, had been in a relationship with a man named Roy Fitzpatrick, but when she'd broken things off with Roy, he got mad. Verbrae had tried to stay away from Roy, but he began stalking her. Verbrae was really scared of Roy and didn't know what to do. Lewis had told her she needed to go to the police, tell them what was happening, and at the very least, get a court injunction that would legally force Roy to stay away from her. Verbrae followed Lewis's advice, and Lewis said he had hoped that that would be the end of it. However, within days, a letter had shown up at his and Diane's house, and it was from Roy. And in this letter, Roy threatened that if Lewis didn't step away from this situation with Verbrae, well, Roy would do something to him. And within days, more letters from Roy began showing up, and they were increasingly more and more threatening. And in the final 3 letters they received, Roy said things like, since Lewis had ruined his relationship with Verbrae, he would do the same thing to Lewis by getting rid of Diane. Detective Palmer was shocked. He still hadn't written off the idea that Julie Williams, the woman who was fighting for her life in a coma, had been the intended target. But there was no way he could ignore that Diane and Lewis seemed to have someone bent on doing them harm. So he asked Lewis if he would go home and bring those threatening letters back so he could take a look at them. Lewis said he would. He said they had actually held onto them with the intention to bring them to the police, but they had held off in fear that, talking to the cops might somehow make things even more dangerous for them. But, given what's happened to Julie here, it was clear they'd waited too long. Once Lewis headed out to get the letters, Palmer asked one of his team members to get all the background information they could on Roy Fitzpatrick. In the meantime, Palmer met with the forensics team, and they said he'd been right. They were sure cyanide had been poured in the water cooler, coffee pot, and the mugs. And one forensic tech said he thought there was enough of this deadly chemical in the break room to kill 150 people. It didn't take Lewis long to return, so Detective Palmer sat down again with him, Diane, and quickly read over the letters that Lewis had brought in. There were 7 in total. A few were handwritten and a few were typed, and they definitely got progressively more threatening, just like Lewis had said. As clear as it was that Roy now had to be considered a major suspect, something still didn't quite make sense to Palmer. How could Roy have gotten into the office building over the weekend? He didn't work at this building, and so he did not have an ID card. But, there was a chance that he might have just crept in unseen with the construction crew or cleaning crew, or anybody else that just happened to come in over the weekend that did have a badge. Palmer asked Diane and Lewis if maybe Roy had any connection to the insurance agency or to any of the other businesses on site in this building. Lewis said he wasn't sure, but he knew Roy worked for a company that did deliver packages all over Tempe. So, maybe that was enough to allow him access to the building without being noticed. On the morning of March 25th, so one day after Julie was rushed to the hospital, Detective Mike Palmer sat inside of a small interview room at the Tempe Police Station reading over the letters that Diane and Lewis had supposedly received from a friend's angry ex-boyfriend, Roy Fitzpatrick. Palmer had barely slept, but he still felt energized. In the course of just a day, this case had gone in a totally different direction that he never would have predicted it. He also now had confirmation from the hospital that Julie, who was still in a coma, had indeed ingested cyanide. And even though Palmer now did have doubts that Julie had been the intended target, regardless, she was the victim of this crime. Palmer didn't want to forget that, and he wanted to get justice for her and her family as quickly as possible. Just then, the door opened and a uniformed police officer led Roy Fitzpatrick into the room. He told Roy to take a seat across the table from Palmer, and then, after he had, that officer stepped out. Detective Palmer slit the threatening letters into a file folder and then took a good look at Roy. Palmer's first impression was that Roy looked more annoyed than nervous. In fact, Roy said he had no idea why he was there. So Palmer started right in with his line of questioning. He asked if Roy had ever gotten violent with his ex-girlfriend, Verbrae Wooten, either when they were together or after they had broken up. Roy shook off the question. He said they'd argue like couples do, and maybe he yelled sometimes, but that was it. So Palmer followed up by asking if Roy had ever sent any threatening letters to Diane and Louis Harry. And at that, a very confused look came across Roy's face. Without missing a beat, Detective Palmer opened up that file folder and slid the letters across the table and asked Roy if he had written them. Roy looked down at the first letter sitting in front of him and he said, "I didn't send that." But Palmer didn't buy it, so he kept pressing, and pretty soon, any attitude that Roy had walked in here with completely dropped. Roy apologized for lying, and he began to shift uncomfortably in his chair. He admitted that he had sent Louis and Diane some letters. He blamed Louis and that stupid court injunction for his ongoing problems with Verbrae. But he said the letters were just posturing, a way for him to sort of get out his anger. He said he would never actually do anything to hurt them. Detective Palmer and Roy spoke for a bit longer. As incriminating as the letters seemed, Palmer knew they were not nearly enough for him to hold Roy for now. Because, without any real evidence linking Roy to the crime, it would be a big leap from someone writing threatening letters to poisoning an office break room with cyanide. And Palmer had been a detective long enough to know that a district attorney would not take on a case against Roy at this point. So, at the end of their interview, Palmer told Roy he could head back home, but he shouldn't be surprised if he soon found himself back in this room. Following the interview with Roy, Detective Palmer called the hospital, hoping against hope that they might have some good news about Julie. But those hopes were quickly dashed. Julie's condition had not improved at all, and doctors feared she actually wouldn't be alive much longer. The call with the hospital really made Palmer mad. Nobody deserved what happened to Julie, but the fact that she might have just been the victim of some insane plot that had nothing to do with her just made things even worse, even though it had only been one day so far. Palmer was determined to keep moving quickly. He sent members of his team to keep pressing building security for the names of the people who'd swiped their badges at the building over the weekend, and he sent others to start interviewing the construction and cleaning crews that had been there as well. And by early afternoon, Detective Palmer's desire to close this case as fast as he possibly could got even stronger. Because news of the poison water cooler had got unpicked up by local reporters and by popular morning radio DJs in Tempe, and this had quickly sparked a panic in the city. People in every office with a water cooler wondered if their water could also be laced with cyanide, and Palmer knew rumors like that could lead to chaos if they didn't get quashed fast. And so, while Palmer waited to hear back from his team, he went back over the notes he'd taken during the past 24 hours. Roy remained his primary suspect, but Palmer still didn't know if this man, who had been angry enough to threaten Louis and Diane, would go so far as to actually indiscriminately poison an entire office break room in the hope that, Diane might get killed in the process. Palmer reread Roy's letters, and when he did, something stood out about the final three, the ones that were by far the most threatening of all of them. And so, as he wondered what to make of them, Palmer decided he would track down the woman who appeared to be at the center of all of this, Roy's ex-girlfriend, Verbrae Wooten. Just hours later, Palmer sat down with Verbrae inside of an interview room at the station, and he made it clear to her that she was not in any trouble. He was just trying to understand her relationship with Roy. And Verbrae said a lot of the same things that Diane and Louis had said, that she and Roy dated seriously for a while, but when she broke it off, Roy started harassing and threatening her. And she regretted that, She knew she played a role in getting Louis and Diane dragged into it as well, because she was pretty sure Roy had begun stalking both of them. Now, none of this was new information to Detective Palmer, but Verbrae's testimony did reinforce the idea that Roy had the motive and the means to commit this heinous crime. But before Palmer wrapped up the interview, Verbrae said something that Palmer couldn't ignore, and it set his mind racing. And within minutes, just from this small piece of information, Detective Palmer thought he knew exactly how the break room poisoning had gone down. This was one of those moments that lead other cops to believe Palmer possessed that sixth sense. Detective Palmer let Verbrae go and hurried back to his desk to continue to look over his notes. Now, despite what his colleagues might think, Palmer would never assume his hunch on something was 100% correct without hard evidence to back it up. But right now, Even though he did feel really strongly that he had a hunch how this went, all he could do was wait, because that hard evidence he needed wasn't something he could just get on his own. Late in the afternoon on the following day, March 26th, Detective Palmer was at the station working the case as he'd done for almost 48 hours straight when a member of his investigative team rushed in and headed straight for him. The officer handed Palmer several sheets of paper and said that they were the record of all the badges that had been swiped to open up the building from past Friday evening until Monday morning, right before Julie was rushed to the hospital. There were a lot of names, but Palmer immediately began scanning over the pages, and quickly, he found exactly what he was looking for. Palmer rallied his team and said the information about the IDs almost sealed the case in his mind. But there were a couple more pieces of evidence he was sure were out there that would make their case airtight. So, Palmer and several other investigators rushed out of the station and headed across town. They arrived at a small office, and Palmer and his team combed through all of it, hoping to find those final pieces of evidence. As Palmer rifled through a bookcase, he found a notepad. He picked it up, flipped through the pages, and then shouted for his team that he had found one of the things they had come for. A few minutes later, one of Palmer's investigators crouched down on the floor and began digging through a trash can, and he suddenly froze. This officer completely trusted Detective Palmer's instincts, but he still couldn't believe he had found the subject just sitting in the trash. He grabbed it in his gloved hand, stood up, and held it up for Palmer to see. And for the first time in 2 days, Palmer felt like he could finally just take a breath. Because between the ID badge report, the notepad in Palmer's hand, and now this object the other officer had found in the trash, Detective Palmer didn't just know what happened to Julie Williams, he knew what happened and he had evidence to back it up. And just as Palmer was getting ready to move in on a suspect, he got word that Julie had passed away. So now he had a murder case on his hands, not just an attempted murder. Based on the ID card report, evidence found at the crime scene and other locations, and interviews conducted over the investigation. This is a reconstruction of what police believe happened that led to Julie Williams getting poisoned. Just after 10:00 on Saturday, March 22nd, 1996, 2 days before Julie was rushed to the hospital, the killer drove slowly through the streets of Tempe, Arizona. The killer wanted to make sure they didn't speed or do anything that might attract attention, because sitting in the passenger seat was what appeared to be a nondescript cardboard box, but inside it held a container of cyanide. The killer pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, but they didn't move. Instead, they scanned the exterior of the office building right in front of them, but all they saw were a couple of construction workers taking a break outside, so basically nobody was around. The killer took a steadying breath, then climbed out of the car, walked around to the passenger side, and grabbed the cardboard box. With the box, they headed to the front door of the building, making sure not to rush. If those construction workers or anybody else saw them, they didn't want to stand out in any way. The killer reached the front door and swiped an ID card over the reader. The door unlocked and the killer made their way inside and down the hallway to the insurance agency. When they stepped inside the insurance office, the killer looked around, making sure nobody was there. But it was all clear, so the killer went to the break room and put the box down on the floor right near the water cooler. Then they grabbed the large water bottle on top of the cooler, trying hard not to spill any water or make any kind of mess. And they managed to turn the large open bottle over and set it on its base on the floor without spilling any. Then they carefully opened up the cardboard box and pulled out a large unmarked plastic bottle. They unscrewed the cap and then grabbed the scooper they had brought out of the box and used it to begin to scoop up the powdered cyanide from that bottle and dump it into the water bottle. They used far more cyanide than they figured they would need to kill someone, but they didn't want to take any chances. Finally, when they were done, they carefully picked up that big water bottle, now laced with tons of cyanide. They raised it up, flipped it over, and put it back on its spot atop the water cooler, again without spilling any water. The killer exhaled. They'd gotten through what was by far the hardest part of their plan, but they still needed to move quickly and get the rest done and get out of that building as quick as they could before anybody saw them. So the killer carried the cyanide bottle across the break room and set it down near the sink. Then they grabbed the clean coffee pot as well as some clean coffee mugs, and they sprinkled more cyanide into all of them. Once the job was done, the killer left the coffee pot and the mugs by the coffee machine, put the cyanide bottle back in the cardboard box, drooped it up, and now at this point, they just wanted to get out of there. So they just ran out of the building back to their car. A few minutes later, the killer arrived back at their house. There, they hid the box until they could discard of it later. And they also slipped their spouse's badge back where they had taken it from without their spouse ever knowing it was gone. Diane Harry, Julie's co-worker, had been absolutely right when she told Detective Palmer that she, not Julie, had likely been the intended target of the cyanide poisoning. But it would turn out it was not Roy Fitzpatrick, the man who Diane thought wanted to kill her, who had actually done the poisoning. Instead, it had been Diane's or husband, Lewis's. It turned out Roy's ex-girlfriend, Verbrae, was not just a friend of Lewis's, she was his lover. In fact, they'd been having a secret affair for months. When she'd filed the court injunction against Roy, Lewis had been the catalyst behind that decision, hoping it would finally get Roy out of the picture for good. But when Roy began sending those threatening letters, Lewis saw a huge opportunity. Investigators believe that Lewis wanted out of his marriage, but he didn't want to deal with the hassle and financial burden of a divorce, so he thought he could just murder Diane and frame Roy for it, using those threatening letters as evidence. But it was actually those 7 letters that initially led Detective Palmer to question if Roy really was the man behind the crime that killed Julie. Because those letters were a mix of handwritten and also typed letters. And the final 3, the ones where Roy allegedly started threatening to actually kill Diane, were all typed. So, there was no way to prove they'd actually been written by Roy. Roy admitted he had sent letters to Lewis and Diane, but he said he had only written 4 of them, and he had only written them by hand. He had not typed any letters. Now, Palmer was not willing to just accept Roy at his word, but he didn't ignore the fact that maybe somebody else had typed and then delivered those final 3 letters, sort of framing Roy. With that in mind, Detective Palmer brought Verbrae in for questioning, and while most of what she said pointed the finger at Roy, there was one thing she told Palmer that helped completely change his mind about the case. Because she said that Lewis was actually in the process of divorcing Diane and that he was already talking to Verbrae about them getting married and starting a family together. But in truth, Lewis had not started the divorce process at all. And Diane still truly believed that she and Lewis were in a faithful, loving marriage. And the final pieces began to fall into place when Detective Palmer received the log of everyone who had used an ID to get into the office building over the weekend, because one of those ID cards belonged to Diane. But Palmer didn't think Diane was the culprit here. Instead, he saw this as further proof that Lewis was the man they were looking for. Clearly, he had used his wife's ID card to sneak into the building. And so when they searched Lewis's office where he worked, Palmer found a notepad, and it was filled with handwritten drafts of the final 3 typed threatening letters that focused on killing Diane. And then also one of Palmer's investigators found something in Lewis's office trash can ad, and it was a receipt from a chemical company that appeared to be for the purchase of cyanide. During this whirlwind investigation, Detective Palmer also came to learn that Lewis had actually first attempted to murder his wife when they were at home by putting cyanide in her scotch. But when the amount of cyanide he used in her scotch just made Diane feel sick for a night, he completely rethought his plan. And he decided killing Diane at work would make it far easier for him to cast suspicion on Roy, even if it meant killing other people in the process. Lewis Harry was found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as multiple counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a chance of parole after 95 years. A quick note about our stories. They're all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.